aged 83 now, you've lived through a time of enormous change. So help the future historians out. What do you think the 20th century will be remembered for?
2 violent and unnecessary wars, I suppose. Tremendous technological progress and be remembered for, no doubt. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Are you somebody who feels generally optimistic about the trajectory we're on, or generally pessimistic?
well, optimistic, yes. I think young people are tremendous and do so many things we didn't do, and we seem to be muddling on rather well, I think.
Well, it's been a rich and varied life for you, incredibly rich and varied. You escaped from Singapore before the Japanese invasion as a small boy, fled to Australia, then to Malawi, school in Zimbabwe, and adult life in Kenya and Singapore. You never had much time to put your roots down, but Cornwall has now been home for 43 years.
Yeah.
Are your roots firmly in place here?
Oh, yes, except that my family isn't really resident here. I mean, I only came here because I thought it was a lovely place to go sailing. My roots have always been abroad, so that I have precious few roots here in Cornwall of family type. But I do regard it as my home.
Yeah. Let's go back to 1933, April the 16th, the day you were born
Yeah.
in Singapore. What sort of family were you born into that day?
Well, my father was a successful lawyer, court man. He'd got a first in the bar final, in fact, in England. Having been in the Indian Army, he retired from that, and he then went straight out, more or less, to Singapore.
So your father had gone to Malaysia to make a living, and
Yes.
he'd met your mother there. What was your mother doing there?
My mother was one of 3 sisters.
She was the daughter of a rubber planter.
Daughter of a rubber planter, correct. In fact, she was born up a river in Thailand because her mother couldn't get downriver to have her because of the monsoon. So she got on with it and had it in a tin hut up in the middle of Thailand. So that's how she arrived.
Gosh.
And her mother was very tough, as you probably gather from
Stoic.
that story.
Yes.
Stoic.
So tell me about your mother. She was looking after you and later on your brother Hugh, who was born when you were 6.
Yes.
What kind of a woman was she?
She was quite gentle, shy, I'd say, in the best sense of the word.
What about as a mother? What kind of a mother was she?
Oh, very, very good mother. She used to send me off to boarding school at the age of 5 or 6 from Singapore to Cameron Highlands, which was the place where European children went. And she used to leave me there with a few tears, I'm afraid, and on both sides.
I bet.
And I was too young, really, for boarding school.
5 or 6 seems incredibly young.
It does.
now, and I
One
guess-
was very homesick, of course.
Were there lots of other 5 and 6-year-old
Yes,
expat
there
children?
were. There were.
And who looked after you? I mean, was there a kindly matron?
The headmistress was a formidable lady called Griffith Jones. She ran the school very efficiently, and I think held up the Japanese advance single-handed for about a week.
Tell me about your father. He was the son of a missionary. In terms of his character, what sort of a man was he?
Oh, he was very intelligent, of course, and forceful. He'd got an MC in the First World War.
Had he? Do you know about where that was and how?
Yes, he joined an Indian Sikh regiment. They were fighting the Turks in Mesopotamia in the First World War. And they were tasked, I hate that word, with advancing down a valley with Turkish machine guns at the far end And he was subaltern with Sikh men under him. The terrain was such that they could not run because of low bushes. And they couldn't crawl because it was too thick, so they had to walk slowly into the mouth of the enemy guns. And he got to the end of the plain with all this low scrub on it, and there was a river, a dried-up river bank or nullah, and the Turkish machine guns at either end. And so he'd got no alternative but to rally his men and say, "Come on, we got to cross this," and with a wicked enfilading fire. Anyway, he was wounded in the leg and managed to staunch the flow of blood with the field dressing they were given. And in order to get it on, he had to lower his trousers, of course, because it was the top of his thigh that had been hit. And having got it on, he fainted. Loss of blood, presumably. And there he was, lying on the far bank of this river, with his trousers down for all to see. Not that that mattered much at that stage, except that his men fortunately concluded that no British officer, if he was alive, would lie in such a degrading position. He must be dead. Therefore, we won't try and rescue him. What he was terrified of was that they would try and rescue him. There's a bit in Kipling about getting him killed as we rescued him, and that came to mind. So fortunately they left him, but this was early morning and he had to lie there all day until nightfall, and then he managed to crawl back to his own lines, several miles, I think, which took some doing.
So he was a clever man, a forceful man.
Yeah.
As a father to you, what was he like?
Oh, very good. He read to us at night, and he was quite sporty. You know, he used to get me to play cricket and that sort of thing. In fact, he built a special cricket net. I had by this time got the cricket bug, and
He built you a net.
he built me a lovely cricket net, and he used to bowl to me, so I had great fun now.
And do you remember ever being aware of the rise of Nazism in Europe?
Yes, the first time I sort of realised it was when we were in Australia, and there was a Japanese attack on Darwin, aerial bombing of Darwin, and then a Japanese submarine made its way into Sydney Harbour. Yeah, one began to realise there was a very nasty war going on.
Yeah. For a bit of sort of background, for people who might not know about why they invaded, so there's an imperial Japanese army.
That's right.
Invading Malaysia, 1941, trying to make a unified East Asia.
Yes.
And that's a pretty extraordinary thing for a small boy to sort of be around and witness.
We were in Australia, of course.
But you fled there as a result of the impending invasion.
Well, really, because my father thought it was coming, but we were 9 or 12 months before the actual fall. We got out in quite good time.
Tell me what you remember about the getting out bit and the run-up to that.
Oh, well, we just boarded a small freighter with a few passengers on board and proceeded in a leisurely manner to go south to Australia. I remember there were some cattle on board, whether they were for our food or for trade, I don't know, but there was a rather horrible occasion when a cow had to be slaughtered on deck. I think for our food it must have been. And they put up awnings to shield us from the grisly sight. But the smell of blood and whatnot was memorable.
Golly. And do you remember there being an atmosphere amongst your parents of not panic, but anxiety?
Well, my father came across to Australia to settle us in, as it were, and then as he anticipated, the Japanese landed and were coming down Malaya, and he thought, rightly I suspect, that he had a job to do and he'd better get back and do it. So he flew back to Singapore when the Japanese were halfway down Malaysia. So it was pretty obvious that he was flying into trouble, a trap, if you like. And my father was sitting in his office near the edge of the quay, Collier Quay in Singapore, and somebody rang up and he said, did you know the surrender party has gone out? In other words, Lieutenant General Percival and his men carrying the Union Jack went out to surrender to the Japanese. So my father tipped his car over the edge of the wharf.
Did he?
To deny it to the Japanese.
Yeah.
And went back to his office to await certain incarceration. The phone rang again and the chap said, we've got a small boat waiting, 3 of us. Do you want to join us? So my father said, you bet, I don't want to sit here. So they said, well, bring some water and meet us on the end of the pier.
God.
So he did, and
Well, how big was that boat? What kind of boat was it?
wasn't more than 22 feet long, probably 20. And they had the wrong sails. They had a world atlas for a chart and a Boy Scout's compass. And they set off.
4 of them?
4 of them. They got across the sea to what is now Indonesia.
How far did they go?
180 miles, something like that.
Oh.
It took them 4 days, I think.
Meanwhile, you and your brother and mother were in Australia and didn't know.
Didn't know what was happening.
Do you remember being aware that your father was missing and that you had to start to cope with the possibility that you wouldn't see him again?
Well, we didn't. Yes, I suppose one did realise that, but a bit phlegmatic at that age.
And what about your mother? Do you remember her feeling worried?
She was obviously very concerned because he could well have been killed in the Japanese invasion or pushed into a prison camp like Changi Jail, which is the infamous Changi Jail. She just didn't know.
From there, your father managed to go to South Africa, and that's where he got in touch and said, I'm alive. And it had been 3 months, I think.
Well, he did it from India, actually. But
he went to Bombay.
That's right.
Right, and alerted you that he was alive.
Yes,
and
that's it.
And it was 3-month hiatus where you heard nothing.
Yes. He got off the ship and was going down the gangway when an Indian came up to him and said, hello, Tuan, how are you? It was a sweeper from Drew and Napier, his firm in Singapore, and he said, I knew you'd be on a ship sometime. I've been meeting all the ships from that part, Indonesia, or as it was then called Sumatra, and here you are. Now, would you like to spend a night in my humble abode?
So he'd been checking for him on every boat?
Checking for him. My father was always very good to people in lowly positions. Anyway, this chap was charming, and put him up for the night.
Yeah.
And the next morning, my father went to the local branch of the Hong Kong bank where the firm, Drew and Napier, held their account in Singapore. Mm. And he went up to the counter, dressed in filthy old shorts and singlet and tennis shoes, or whatever you call them, and said to the chap on the desk, now, my name's O'Connor. I've just escaped from Singapore. I was a partner in Drew and Napier, and if you look into your records, you will see that you received I forget what the sum was, but it was a considerable sum from us.
All of their money?
All basically. Of our client account was being transferred across to India to keep it safe. Do you think, check it out, but do you think that once you're satisfied about that, you could lend me 50 rupees for a shave and a shower? And the chap said, hold on, sir, I must speak to my manager. So he trotted off. He brought the manager back, and the manager said, well, have you got any ID? And he said, no, but you look in your books, you'll see. And the chap went away and had a look, and he said, yes, I found the transfer. Yes, we got a nice lot of money there. Thank you very much. My father said, well, now, what about the 50 rupees for a shave? I'm afraid we can't help you there, sir. Couldn't bloody give him that. So the sequel to the story is that after the war had ended, my father went back to Malaya as Attorney General. And during the course of tidying up, he went down to Singapore to sort of see the firm, right? The first thing he did was to transfer
every penny
to the Standard Chartered Bank, who have got fat on it ever since.
Excellent. Tell me about life in Adelaide.
Oh, well, I went to school at Prince Alfred's College. I remember having awful trouble with long division, and I had a charming teacher on whom I developed, the female teacher, a colossal crush, and she managed to get me to do long division. I'll never forget that. And I also picked up an insatiable love of cricket, which has never left me.
Right.
We used to terrific heat waves,
Really?
No air conditioning, no refrigeration, and we used to go and fetch a block of ice from the shop at the end of the road on a pram.
Yeah.
I would sit on the top of the block of ice and be wheeled back, I remember.
And you moved once again, as you say, your father phoned
Yes.
up and begged for a job from the colonial service, and it was moved to Malawi, what's now called
That's
Malawi.
right, it is now.
And you moved to Zomba, the capital.
Correct.
What occupied you there?
Oh, well, we lived on the slopes of Zomba Mountain, which was a lovely position. Just a little bungalow, colonial bungalow, looking across the valley to two blue hills called Malangi and Machesi. And
It sounds beautiful.
yeah, it was.
Yeah.
With a stream running down through the garden. And I just remember diverting this, across new territory and so forth, bridges and things like that.
Yeah.
And playing cricket, of course, in the net when anybody was there to bowl to me. I remember eating the entire fruit of a banana passion fruit tree, which grew in the garden, and it was quite a lot of passion fruit. Well, within 20 minutes, I'd swollen up like a Michelin man.
Oh, no.
I could hardly move with the tightness of everything. My mother plunged me into a bath of cold water with some old remedy, and eventually the swelling subsided, but it was quite alarming at the time. Served me right, I suppose.
And you went to school in southern Rhodesia, now
That's right.
Zimbabwe. And the journey there,
Yes.
journey alone sounds like a wild adventure.
Oh, it was a great adventure because we got on the train at Limby, which was the railhead for Blantyre, the capital of Nyasaland, I like to call it.
Yes.
And the school train, it was, beginning and end of every term. And we were children headed for southern Africa, where the schools were better. But the strict segregation of the sexes, the girls were in the front half of the train. A formidable matriarch was stationed in the middle of the train. And we boys were at the back.
Hammering on the
There's
door.
supposed to be no contact. Why we should have wanted contact except to beat up the girls, I can't think, because we were under 10, most of us.
How many days was the train
It
ride?
was 4 days and 3 nights consecutive, the beginning and end of every term. And it went quite slowly, this train, so we were able to get off and replenish our catapult.
What did you
stones.
shoot at with your catapults?
Panes of glass whenever available. And there wasn't an unbroken pane of glass between Limby and Lorenzo Marx, I don't think.
There was one boy who fell out of his top bunk, straight
Yes.
out of his window, out onto the tracks, and was found wandering along the tracks in his pyjamas the next day.
That's right.
Completely unharmed.
No, completely unharmed. I mean, he'd probably been asleep and therefore fell in a relaxed manner, which is important, of course, if you're to avoid injury. Yeah, there were 3 tiers, 3 bunks in each of these compartments, and the middle one was level with the open window. So
Out he toppled.
just slid off the slippery surface.
So you'd boarded since you were 5 or 6. So by the time you were boarding down in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia,
Yeah.
were you quite accustomed to it, or did you remain quite homesick?
I don't know that I was homesick. We were pretty tough sort of South African-oriented school. We used to go out into the bush and build ourselves little houses in the rocks with grass roofs, and we knew what fruit we could eat off the trees in the bush, which, we learnt a bit of bush law.
And then another ship, this time back to the UK, where you witnessed something completely extraordinary.
Oh, yes. We caught a steamer up the coast, east coast of Africa and through the Suez Canal. It was really exciting.
Yeah.
And we got into the Mediterranean and joined a convoy, because the war was still very much on, and the Med was still quite a dangerous...
What year are we in?
45.
45. So you would have been, born in 12.
Yeah.
You were 12.
So we joined this convoy, and that itself was exciting because there were a lot of destroyers, frigates and other warships around. And we set off, and we were sharing a cabin with... when I say we, me and my friend, we were sharing cabin together, and we had a third person occupying it who was a single man. And as the voyage went on, we discovered that this man was behaving rather oddly. I mean, he would spend hours looking through the porthole with binoculars at, it seemed to us, the escorting naval ships. And we were quite sure he was taking notes of their armament and so forth. At that time, spies were rampant, everything was a spy. Keep quiet, don't say this in case, and all the rest of it. And we had a slight suspicion about this, but what confirmed the suspicion was that every night he would inject himself in the leg with a hypodermic syringe. Now that was conclusive proof to us that he was a spy. So we went to the captain.
Do you remember going to the captain?
Oh, yes.
Knock on the door?
Oh, yes.
Who was the captain? Did you see him around a
I
lot?
can't remember. No, he was a sort of remote, very important figure somewhere in the bowels of the ship.
So he must have been having a perfectly normal day, writing a letter at his desk, when a 12-year-old and a
Yes.
14-year-old knocked on the door.
Yes.
In
and
you
said,
came.
Could we speak to you, please, sir? Yes, he said, what do you want? And we explained that we'd got a spy in the cabin. And we thought he ought to clap him into irons immediately in case he prejudiced the entire convoy. So he said, I'll see what I can do. And then he called us in a bit later and he said, I've made investigation and I think you'll find it's all right. He's a bird-watching diabetic. So we left it at that.
But that's kind of played into this idea that the war for a young boy in those days was pure boy's own adventure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, adventure from one waking till sleeping.
When you were living in Malawi, how had you got news of the war? How closely were you following what was
Well,
going
we
on?
got lots of newsreels.
What does that mean?
Well, when you went to the cinema, which was about the only social or cultural thing that one had to do, I was able to do, it was always preceded by Gaumont British News with stirring martial music. And then there would be a report on the latest battlefield scene somewhere, aircraft crashing, being shot down. And Lionel Gamblin was the name of the reporter in a stirring British voice. And he would say, we lost a couple of planes yesterday, but we shot down 44 enemy and so on and so forth. And it was always very exciting. And we knew that the battle was raging. And then when we got in our trip across the Mediterranean in the convoy, we were approaching Gibraltar. VE Day was announced. Germany has surrendered. Terrific news. And I'm not sure we did cheering and all that sort of thing. But anyway, as we got to the end of the Med, Gibraltar, we were confronted by a line of U-boats with white flags up, surrendering. And these U-boats had been objects of terror to us as we went along.
Can you describe what that looked like?
Well, just a line of these sinister, things which submarines always are, aren't they? Rather sinister. And they had white flags on their jackstaff instead of swastikas or whatever they normally had there. And they were coming into Gibraltar to surrender to the British.
Gosh.
And then we went on from Gibraltar and arrived at Liverpool.
Was this the first time you'd ever been to the UK?
We'd been back on leave when I was quite small.
So as a relatively older boy,
yes,
this was the first
time
sighting.
I was able to take any of this in. And there was Liverpool, battered but unbowed,
Yeah.
And one was rather proud.
When you say battered, what did you see?
Bomb damage, traces of heavy military activity.
It's quite surprising in a way that you, having never really been to the UK, you still felt very British and
oh yes,
patriotic.
we were so pro-British that probably more than anyone in England. Part of the British Empire,
So it must have been quite a moment arriving back.
Oh, it was. It was quite moving.
So you arrived back and you had 18 months to swat up for common entrance to Sherborne, which you
Yes.
sailed through, and off you went to Sherborne. What sort of a pupil were you at secondary school?
Bloody idle, I suppose, really. I mean, I was far more interested in games than anything else. I forgot all the Latin. I think I got 100% in my common entrance Latin. And by the time I got to school certificate a couple of years later, I'd forgotten most of it. The standard of teaching was pretty abysmal looking back on it.
It was a pretty rigid place, I imagine, those post-war years, and
Oh, yes.
little in the way of what in common parlance is known as pastoral care. What was it like? Ice-cold plunges, rationing?
Yes, it was tough. Now, I survived because of my sporting ability. But
Interesting that you used the word survived.
yeah, some didn't. Because it was a really Puritan regime, to put it mildly.
Give me an example.
Well, you had to do everything absolutely on time. And if you failed, you were probably beaten. And one favourite punishment, which was frequently allotted, was 3 days calling. Now, that meant that for the next 3 days, the moment the rising bell went, you had to run downstairs, plunge into the communal cold bath, out again, dry yourself, get dressed with unnatural things like stiff collars and studs and ties and things like that, and go and find the prefect in his dormitory who's hogging it in bed still, and report. And if you were late, you got another 3 days, a minute late. So I managed to survive it.
And what qualities in you helped?
I mean, one got extremely fit. We had a regime in the evenings as we went up to change into sleeping attire in the dormitories. There was a thing called a horizontal bar suspended from the ceiling, which we had to do leg ups on. Now that meant hanging from the bar without your feet touching the ground and hoiking your legs up and over your head and down over your back. So you twisted round, of course, and down again and up again and down again. And one had to do so many of these. They were very beneficial to the muscles of your stomach.
Yeah.
And I remember inviting anybody who wanted to hit me as hard as they liked in the stomach.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel it. I had these 2 ropes of muscle down the front, so I thought, well, that's fine. I suppose everyone else did.
You were physically tough and you were good at sport. What about emotionally? Were you emotionally resilient?
Well, my parents were abroad most of the time.
Which could have led to you going, it sort of could have been either way in a way. It could have weakened
I
you
mean,
somehow.
one just had to toughen up a bit. You didn't have anywhere to go and cry on. I used to get cakes 3 times a term, I think. And
Sent from who and where?
Sent from parents via a baker of some description. And I used to shave thinner and thinner slices to try and make the thing last. I mean, we were continually hungry, that's one thing.
Because rationing went on up until the early 1950s, didn't it? Long after the war ended.
Yes, yes.
So this was post-war, but still within the
post-war.
rationing.
And I mean, actually, people forget, but the post-war Britain was almost tougher than wartime Britain. Rationing, power strikes, coal strikes. Winter of 47 was the coldest on record. I mean, I remember we could drive in cars across ponds because it was so hard.
And sport, as you say, was a huge passion and has
Yes,
been ever since. So
yes.
cricket was a very big deal. Rugby, boxing.
I was no good at rugby because I was too, my excuse was I was too light. My children will not believe me, but I was actually 8 stone when I left at the age of 18. So I was skin and bone and muscle. You know, I was really extremely fit, wonderfully fit. And I used to go on to having cold baths after I left because I felt invigorated by it.
Yeah.
I gave it up after a bit. But,
1951, you walked out of the school gates for the last time. What was the plan?
well, I just wanted to make some money and buy a car and that sort of thing. Started off with an old motorbike, which was great fun.
You wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge.
Yes, I would have liked that.
And why didn't you?
Well,
you ended up going to King's College London. Why
I
not
don't
Oxford?
quite know. I think it's my father didn't feel he could afford Oxford or Cambridge.
Why law?
I put it down to my housemaster telling me I argued so much that I'd better be a lawyer. I can't think of any other.
And you lived in Clapham Common and then Cranley Gardens in South
That's
Kensington.
right. That's right.
You know, this was London in the 1950s. It wasn't yet the swinging 60s. The 50s was when people say that's when the teenager was invented, as it were. Coffee bars, milk bars
Yes.
were kind of rising up. You tapped into that scene?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
What did you do for fun? Soho was where it was.
Pubs, where I had a chaste half pint of bitter and a cheese sandwich for lunch. It was just fun living in London. I mean, I loved London. I thought there's nowhere else in the world I ever want to live. But it did so happen that I had to move.
Like many students, you were quite hard up at
Oh,
this
yes.
stage. Do you remember that feeling of being really cash-strapped?
Oh, yes. Again, my children won't believe this, but I used to walk to bus stops to save a farthing, which was, worth something in those days. Quarter of a penny.
When you lived in Cranley Gardens, Mrs. Bailey was your landlady.
Dear Mrs. Bailey.
She used to bring you a full English breakfast on a tray every morning.
That's right.
And one particular morning, she arrived looking rather anxious. It was the day that the exam results were published in the newspaper, your exam results.
That's right, and bar final.
Your bar final exam results. She couldn't see your name in the list of people who'd passed.
I shouldn't tell this story, but yes. She, so I anxiously perused the list and said, something unrepeatable. God, I must have failed a bloody thing. And then I looked up, and in the second class honours, I think I'd come 9th out of 550 or something, so I'd got a second. And I had passed. That was the great relief.